He built more railroad than any man in American history. Without a government land grant, without federal subsidies, without the corruption that defined every other transcontinental railroad of his era. Then the United States government called him a criminal and ordered his empire destroyed. James Jerome Hill, the empire builder. The man who connected the Pacific Northwest to the rest of America using nothing but his own money, his own will, and a ferocious understanding of how railroads actually work. By the time the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of his Northern Securities Company in 1904, Hill controlled nearly 40,000 miles of track stretching from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast. He had done what the Union Pacific and Central Pacific couldn't, built a profitable transcontinental railroad that didn't require constant government bailouts to survive, and they called him a monopolist. The paradox is real. Though Hill was guilty of the charge in the technical sense, he had consolidated control over competing railroads to eliminate price wars and stabilize the northern tier of American railroad commerce. But the men who came before him had been given millions of acres of public land and still gone bankrupt. Hill had taken nothing from the government and built something that worked. The story starts in Canada in 1838 with a boy who lost an eye. James Hill was born in Rockwood, Ontario, to a farming family with modest means and large ambitions. At the age of 18, an archery accident cost him the sight in his right eye, permanently ending his plans to become a ship's captain. He redirected his ambitions westward instead, arriving in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1856 with $17 and the specific intention of finding his way to the Pacific. He never got to the Pacific. Not that year. Instead, he found work as a shipping clerk, then as a steamboat agent, then as a freight forwarder along the Red River. He was methodical, detail-obsessed, and possessed of a memory that railroad men described as photographic. He could recall freight rates, shipping volumes, and cargo manifests from years earlier without consulting records. He also understood something that most businessmen of his era didn't: the relationship between transportation costs and economic development. Lower freight rates meant more farmers could afford to ship their grain to market. More farmers shipping grain meant more revenue for the railroad. The business wasn't just moving freight, it was creating the conditions for freight to exist. By 1870, Hill was a successful freight agent with connections throughout the upper Midwest. He was also watching the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, a bankrupt, half-built line that extended a few hundred miles into Minnesota and then stopped, with considerable interest. The St. Paul and Pacific was a disaster by any standard, poorly built, inadequately capitalized. Its investors, mostly Dutch, and had sunk millions into a railroad that generated almost no revenue. The line was in receivership, its tracks rusting, its locomotives sitting idle. Most businessmen looked at the St. Paul and Pacific and saw a bad investment. Hill looked at it and saw the spine of a transcontinental railroad. In 1878, Hill and three partners, Donald Smith, George Stephen, and Norman Kitson, bought the St. Paul and Pacific out of receivership for about $6.7 million. The Dutch bondholders, desperate to recover something from their investment, accepted. Hill's partners provided most of the capital. Hill provided the vision and the operational expertise. He rebuilt the line. Not just repaired it, rebuilt it. Better grades, heavier rail, improved bridges, the kind of construction that cost more upfront but saved money over decades in maintenance and operating costs. While other railroad builders were cutting corners to maximize mileage, Hill was cutting mileage to maximize quality. The line became the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway. Within a few years, it was profitable, genuinely profitable, not profitable the way many railroad companies of the era claimed to be profitable while hiding debt in complex accounting. Hill ran a tight operation. He knew his cost per ton-mile to 4 decimal places. He knew which sections of track generated profit and which didn't. He eliminated what didn't work and expanded what did. By the mid-1880s, Hill was ready for the next step, the Pacific. The conventional wisdom said you needed government land grants to build a transcontinental railroad. The Union Pacific had received 10 million acres. The Central Pacific had received 8 million. The Northern Pacific, which had tried to build along essentially the same route Hill was planning, had received 47 million acres and still couldn't make it work without constant financial rescue. Hill didn't ask for land grants. He didn't think he needed them. What he needed was a good route, a disciplined construction, and the economic development of the territory his railroad would serve. The route he chose followed the Marias Pass through the Rocky Mountains, 2,000 feet lower than the passes used by competing lines. Lower elevation meant gentler grades. Gentler grades meant heavier trains. Heavier trains meant lower cost per ton. Lower cost per ton meant lower freight rates. Lower freight rates meant more traffic. Construction of the Great Northern Railway began in 1887. But Hill's crews built 643 miles of track in 1887 alone, a rate that competing railroads with government subsidies couldn't match. They built in winter conditions that stopped other construction projects. They built through terrain that had defeated earlier attempts. But the construction was the easy part. The hard part was making it pay. Hill understood that a railroad through empty territory generates no revenue. The Great Northern needed settlers, farmers, arabisnev, customers who would use the railroad to move their products to market. He launched systematic agricultural development programs, bringing settlers from Europe and the eastern United States with promotional materials, subsidized seed grain, and demonstration farms that showed what the northern plains could produce. He imported Aberdeen Angus cattle and distributed them to farmers at cost, establishing the beef industry in Montana and the Dakotas. And he worked with agricultural colleges to develop better farming techniques for the dry climate of the northern plains. He hired experts to identify the best crops for each region his railroad served. It wasn't charity. Every bushel of wheat those farmers produced was a bushel that needed to move to market on his railroad. Hill was cultivating his own customer base with deliberate precision. On January 6, 1893, the Great Northern Railway's last spike was driven at scenic Washington. The line ran from St. Paul to Seattle. 1,800 miles of track built without a single acre of government land grant. It was the only transcontinental railroad in American history built entirely with private capital. 6 months later, a financial panic collapsed the American economy. The Union Pacific went bankrupt. The Northern Pacific went bankrupt. Nearly a third of American railroad mileage went into receivership. The Great Northern survived. More than survived. It continued paying dividends through the panic. But Hill's conservative financing and genuinely profitable operations gave it a cushion that debt-laden competitors didn't have. The panic also gave Hill an opportunity. The Northern Pacific, his rival for the northern transcontinental market, emerged from bankruptcy in 1896 under new management. Hill recognized that the competition between the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific was destroying both lines. Rate wars were cutting revenues without generating new traffic. If the northern tier of the country didn't need 2 competing transcontinentals, it needed one well-managed system. Hill began buying Northern Pacific stock, quietly, through intermediaries. By 1901, he had effective control. He also wanted access to Chicago, the financial and commercial center of the American heartland. The Burlington Railroad had the routes he needed. In 1901, Hill and his partner J.P. Morgan bought the Burlington for $200 million. That purchase triggered a crisis. E.H. Harriman, one who controlled the Union Pacific and had his own designs on the Burlington, had been outbid. He retaliated by attempting to buy enough Northern Pacific stock to take control of that railroad away from Hill. The battle sent Northern Pacific shares soaring from $100 to $1,000 in a matter of days as the two sides competed for shares. Investors who had borrowed money to buy Northern Pacific at $100 were suddenly facing margin calls they couldn't meet. But the resulting panic briefly threatened to destabilize the entire American financial system. Hill and Harriman eventually settled by agreeing to combine their holdings into a single holding company, Northern Securities. The company controlled the Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, and the Burlington, essentially the entire Northern Railroad network. President Theodore Roosevelt saw an opportunity, and he had been elected on a platform of trust-busting, reining in the great corporate combinations that increasingly dominated American economic life. Northern Securities was a perfect target. Big, visible, controlled by recognizable plutocrats, and, unlike the combinations that existed in genuinely uncompetitive markets, operating in a sector where competition had a clear and measurable history. In 1902, Roosevelt's Attorney General filed suit under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1904. The court ordered Northern Securities dissolved by a 5-4 vote. Hill was furious. He argued, with considerable logic, that the dissolution would harm the economy rather than help it. The combination had stabilized rates, improved service, and created efficiencies. Breaking it up would just recreate the rate wars and financial instability that had preceded it. He was partially right. The dissolution of Northern Securities didn't restore meaningful competition to the Northern tier, and the Great Northern and Northern Pacific continued to coordinate informally. Rates stayed stable. Service continued to improve, but the precedent mattered. Northern Securities established that the federal government would use antitrust law against railroad combinations, regardless of whether those combinations had created genuine efficiencies. Hill kept working. He continued to develop the territory his railroads served. He continued to push for lower freight rates. He continued to obsess over cost per ton mile in ways that other railroad executives found baffling. He died in 1916, at the age of 77, still working. The Great Northern and Northern Pacific eventually merged in 1970, 66 years after the Supreme Court had ordered their combination dissolved, to form the Burlington Northern Railroad. The merger Hill had wanted finally achieved when the regulatory environment had changed enough to permit it. The empire Hill built still carries freight across the northern United States today as BNSF Railway, the largest freight railroad in North America. The Marias Pass route he chose in 1887 still carries trains through the Rockies at grades that competing lines can't match. James Hill never lost his conviction that he was right and the government was wrong. Not because he was above the law, but because he genuinely believed that what he had built was good for America, that efficient, profitable railroads serving agricultural communities was a greater public benefit than the competition the antitrust laws were supposed to protect. The empire builder, criminal, visionary, the man who built more railroad than anyone in American history without taking $1 of government money and still got called a monopolist. The tracks are still there, still carrying freight, still following the route he surveyed through the Rockies in the 1880s, still doing what he built them to do.